Hi and welcome back to ThisBytesForYou. In this video, we're going to be going over a review of the EVGA Geforce RTX 3060 XE gaming card. So we're going to be going over a bunch of games, gameplay, benchmarks, then we're going to be going over in those benchmarks how much heat it generates, how much power it consumes, and of course all the benchmarking scores. I'm also going to be showing you or giving you links in this video on how to install the card for those of you that may not know how to. And then also in this video, I'm going to be showing you the unboxing of the card, which is pretty important. That way, when you buy the card, you know exactly everything that comes in the box. I'll ruin it for you. Nothing comes in the box but the card. So it does require an 8-pin PCIe connection, not a 6-pin, not two 6-pins, but one single 8-pin. And yes, it does need to be connected in order for it to work. All right, so that way at least you know, hey, I need to buy an adapter or my power supply is good enough. Okay. So the card draws up to 170 watts, but EVGA does recommend a 550 watt power supply, not just for the video card, but for the overall system. So I definitely recommend at least 550, if not higher. It's only going to use what it needs. So this is a PCIe by 4 card, but it will work on PCIe 3.0. So it is backwards compatible. So we're also going to be going in the benchmarks over the performance of its little brother or little sister, the EVGA 2060 KO gaming card. So definitely some comparisons there as well. So now comparing, the EVGA 2060 KO gaming card only had 6 gigs of RAM, whereas the 3060 has 12 gigs of RAM. 12 gigs running at 15,000 megahertz effective, whereas this one was 14,000 megahertz effective. Both 192-bit, and this one running at 360 gigabytes per second. I'll also have the GPU-Z comparison right up here on the screen, so you guys can compare the differences between the two. Now, this card comes with a 3-year warranty, which is awesome, and EVGA's support is the best ever. I've dealt with them a few times on older products. They are amazing. All right, so this card does have, again, utilizing PCIe 4.0, it has 1 HDMI port and 3 display ports. Now, on the comparison side, this one only has a DVI, an HDMI, and a display port. So the 2060 is a little limited that way. So the games we're going to be playing are Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Call of Duty Warzone, Grand Theft Auto 5, Fortnite, and Red Dead Redemption. So before I get into actual gameplay, you can check out the video up above for how to install the video card as well. Again, in case you don't know how to, but don't worry, you don't have to click on those immediately. You can if you want to, but I'm going to have links to everything I link in the description down below, as well as my system specs and where you can find all the parts. If you can find them. I know video cards right now, both on the AMD front and the NVIDIA front, are so difficult to find right now. All right, now, so for benchmarks, starting off with synthetics, we can see in 3D Mark FireStrike, here we can see the 2060 scored 19,006, while the 3060 outperformed it by 3.68%, coming in at 19,719. On the graphics side, there was a 4.77% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060. Now, the odd part here is on the physics side. The 2060 outperformed the 3060 on the physics, being that the 2060 has 1,920 shaders and the 3060 has 3,584 CUDA cores. Now mind you, a 32% improvement on the 2060 over the 3060 is really nothing to talk about, but I thought it was important to mention it. Now, jumping over to TimeSpy, we can see the 2060 came in at 8,152, while the 3060 came in at 9,091, a 10.89% improvement on the 3060. Now, on the graphics side, we can see the 2060 came in at 7,684, while the 3060 came in at 8,669. Again, the crown goes to the 3060, coming in at 12.05% higher. Now, before we were talking about physics, now we're talking about CPU. We can see the KO again outperformed the 3060 by 1.93%. At least it hit that one at almost even 2%. Not incredibly important, but it's there. Now, on this one, we can see the KO came in at 315 watts on average, while the 3060, a little bit higher, came in at 320 watts on average. And then on the GPU side, the temperature was 4 degrees higher, 67.2 degrees on the 2060 versus 63.3 on the 3060. Now, on Port Royale, we can see the 2060 came in at 4,081, while the 3060 came in at 5,039, a 21.01% improvement on the 3060. That's pretty significant, but there's a lot more than just that. So stick with me on this. So we can see the 2060 came in on average at 290 watts, while the 3060 consumed a little bit at 304 watts. So 14 watts more on the 3060. Now the 2060 came in at 65.9 degrees Celsius, while on the 3060 we came in at 62.4. 3 degrees hotter. And then on the hotspot, the 2060 came in at 81.5, and the 3060 came in at 79.9. So about almost 2 degrees there. Now, jumping in over to gaming benchmarks, real world kind of stuff here. We can see on Assassin's Creed Odyssey at 1080p, on medium, there was a 5.61% improvement from the 2060 to the 3060, 3060 becoming the crown. You'll notice the little arrow pointing over to the 3060, and I'll get why in a minute why that did that. But then over on high, we can see there was a 7.73% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060. Definitely everything is playable so far. So the 2060 consumed 307 watts on average, while the 3060 consumed 310 watts on average. So the 3060 came in just a little bit higher there. Now on the heat side, again, the KO takes the crown at 61.9 degrees, while the 3060 came in at 59.4 degrees. So the KR took the crown, but it was the hot crown. Nobody wants the hot crown. On the hot spot, the KO took 77.5 degrees, while the 3060 was at 71.8 degrees. Again, the 3060 coming in cooler. And then finally, on Ultra, we see an 8.13% improvement in favor of the 3060. The 2060 came in at 320 watts on average, while the 3060 came in at 308 watts on average. 67.4 degrees on the 2060, while the 3060 kept nice and cool at 59.4 degrees. So you may or may not know the 3060 is geared more for 1440p or 2K gaming, whereas the 2060 was geared more for 1080p. And we can see that here. On Assassin's Creed Odyssey at 1440p, we can see a 38.46% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060. That is amazing on medium. Now with that, they consumed the same amount of power on average, 320 watts Now, the KO here came in at 65.5 degrees Celsius, while the 3060 came in at 59.4. So the 3060 keeps nice and very cool. Now, on high, we can see a 46.15% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060. Here we can see the 2060 held on to that 320 watts on average, while the 3060 let go and only consumed 311 watts on average. Now here we can see again the 2060 consumed, or should I say, got as high in heat as 65.3 degrees Celsius, and the 3060 came in at 59.7. On Ultra, there was a 47.79% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060. That is absurd. Now here we can see the KO took the crown again, consuming 324 watts on average, while the 3060 only consumed 315 watts on average. Yeah, the 2060 still got hot here, coming in at 69.2 degrees, and the 3060 coming in at 59.6 degrees. Now the heat here, along with every other benchmark here, is the hottest it hit. It doesn't mean it stayed there for an hour. It just hit that temperature. Sometimes it would go a lot lower, and many times it would go a lot lower. So I definitely want to mention that. So now jumping into the magical 4K. It was not advertised to be a 4K card, so don't expect it, but expect to be surprised. So here we can see the 3060 outperformed the 2060 by 41.67%. So here we can see on average the 2060 consumed 322 watts on average, while the 3060 only consumed 310 watts on average. The 2060 came in at 69.7 degrees Celsius, while the 3060 came in at 60.8 degrees Celsius. Jumping over to high, we can see the 3060 once again outperformed the 2060 by 45%. Then here on average, again, the 2060 held on to that 322 watt average, while the 3060 came in at 316 watts on average. Then the 2060 came in at 69.7 degrees Celsius, while the 3060, 60.7 degrees Celsius. Then on Ultra, mind you, there was a 130% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060, but both chugged along hard. 2060 coming in at 7 frames per second, while the 3060 chugged along at 33%. Still faster, but when two turtles are racing, you fall asleep. So here we can see the 2060 actually consumed less, 318 watts on average, while the 3060 consumed 320 watts on average. 2 watts, but you're both crawling along. I don't know what to tell you on that one. The 2060 came in at 66.3 degrees on Celsius, while the 3060 came in at 61.6 degrees. Not a huge difference there, but they're both crawling at that point. Now, coming over to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At 1080p, we can see there was a 31.58% powerhouse improvement on the 3060 over the 2060. Again, 31.58. Mind you, the 2060 came in at 80 frames per second, while the 3060 came in at 110 frames per second. Mind you, this is 1080p at medium, but here the 2060 consumed 300 watts on average, while the 3060 consumed only 275 watts. Now, on high, we can see again the 3060 outpaced the 2060 by 36.48%. Now, on high here, we have 308 watts on average consumed by the 2060 and 273 watts on average consumed by the 3060. Then with that, 62.6 degrees on the 2060 and 58.9 degrees on the 3060. Now coming in on Ultra, there was a 14.88% improvement towards the 3060. The 2060 almost hit the magical 60 frames per second, coming in at 56 frames per second, which to me is still very playable. But the 3060 came in above 60 at 65 frames per second. Now here, 320 watts on average for the 2060 and 288 watts for the 3060 and 63.8 degrees on the 2060, while the 3060 kept nice and cool at 56.9 degrees. 1440p, 2K gaming. Again, what the 3060 was meant for on medium came in at 93 frames per second, while the 2060, still good, came in at 63 frames per second. The 3060 beat it by 38.46%. Now, the 2060 consumed on average 313 watts, and the 3060 285 watts on average. On high, we can see again, the 3060 came out 46.15% above the 2060. 2060 at 50 frames per second, maybe kind of playable. I would say still playable, but the 3060 came in at a beautiful 80 frames per second. I'll take that any day. Then 315 watts on average on the 2060 and 280 watts on average on the 3060. I'm kind of leaving out the temperature. It's still on the screen, but I'm leaving it to save you guys some time. On Ultra, we can see again, the 3060 came out 47.79% above the 2060. 2060 coming in at 43 frames per second. The 3060 at 70 frames per second. Don't get mad at the 2060. Again, it came out being touted as the best 1080p card, and it's still doing pretty good at 1080p. 1440, 3060 takes the crown. So on Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 4K, at medium, the 3060 came in at 73 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 38 frames per second. A 63.06% performance gain on the 3060. That is tremendous. So again, that was at medium, and we consumed on average 322 watts on the 2060, while the 3060 came in at 310 watts. Okay, so now coming over to high, we can see there was a 66.67% improvement towards the 3060, coming in at 62 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 31 frames per second. 322 watts on average for the 2060 and 316 watts on average by the 3060. Now, at Ultra, the 3060 was kind of playable, or I would say playable, at 55 frames per second, but the 2060 just got under the table and hid and said, no! Coming in at only 7 frames per second. That hurts. Now, it couldn't do much, so it only came in at 318 watts on average, while the 3060 came in at 320 watts on average. Now, I usually don't do racing games, but I wanted to diversify the review a little bit because I know some of you are racing fans. So we come in with F1 2020. We can see here at 1080p on medium, everything is tearing it apart here, but we can see a 21.24% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060, coming in at 250 over 202 frames per second. These cards are destroying it at 1080p. The 2060 came in at 335 watts on average, while the 3060 came in at 305 watts on average. Then on high, we can see a 32.13% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060, coming in at 242 frames per second over 175 frames per second, then consuming 335 watts on average, while the 2060 consumed a little bit more at 320 watts on average. On Ultra, we can see the card started hurting a little bit, not a lot, a bit, obviously. There was a 29.97% improvement on the 3060 over the 2060, coming in at 165 frames per second versus 122 frames per second. Now, here the 2060 consumed 335 watts on average, while the 3060 consumed only 314 watts on average. Jumping up to 2K or 1440p, we can see on medium, there was a 96% improvement on the 3060, coming in at 222 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at only 78 frames per second. A little bit odd here, but stick with me. 335 watts on average by the 2060 and 330 watts on average by the 3060. 335 watts on average by the 2060 versus the 330 watts by the 3060. On high, there was a 43.96% improvement, 197 frames per second on the 3060 versus the 2060 that had 126 frames per second, 332 watts on the 2060 versus the 3060's 336 watts on average. Jumping over to Ultra, here we're starting to feel it a little bit. 39.30% improvement on the 3060, coming in at 137 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 92 frames per second, 330 watts on the 2060, and 323 watts on the 3060. Finally, at 4K, we can start to see F1 2020 start to struggle a little bit. When I say a little bit, I really mean a little bit. So on medium, we can see the 2060 came in at 78 frames per second, while the 3060 was 142 frames per second. A 58.18% improvement on performance here. Now, the 2060 consumed 323 watts, while the 3060 consumed more at 340 watts on average. On high, we can see the 2060 came in at 70 frames per second, while the 3060 came in at 125 frames per second. A 56.41% improvement. Now with that improvement, the 2060 came in at 322 watts on average, while the 3060 came in at 337 watts on average. This game seems to make the 3060 consume more power, but it's more playable, so we're good there. On Ultra, at 4K, here's where we start to see the real pain. The 2060 comes in at 53 frames per second. Now, on an FPS and a racing game, you can't go below 60. You're gonna crash, you're gonna get shot. You know, you want the higher the better, right? The 3060 took care of you, coming in at 92 frames per second. That's 53.79% better than the 2060. Now, with that performance improvement, the 2060 came in at 322 watts on average, while the 3060 came in at 330 watts on average. Metro Exodus, a video card killer, is slowly starting to be tamed by the video cards. It is an older game, not incredibly older, but anyway, we can see at 1080p here, the 3060 came in at 111.83 frames per second over the 2060's 95.16 frames per second. A 16.11% improvement here on the 3060. Moving over to high, we can see the 3060 came in at 83.72 frames per second over the 2060's 75.3 frames per second, coming in 10.59% faster than the 2060. Now on Ultra, which I have named Extreme, but it's Ultra, we can see the 3060 came in at 64.61 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 59.48 frames per second, an 8.26% improvement in the 3060's favor. We can see here the 2060 didn't come in at the magical 60 frames per second, but at 59, you're just splitting hairs here. Anyway, now on 4K, we can see, or 2160, we can see on medium, we're chugging along at 41.73 frames per second on the 2060, and on the 3060, 49.26%, 16.55% improvement in favor of the 3060, but yeah. On high, we can see the 3060 came in at 38.7 frames per second, a 13.55% improvement over the 2060's 33.79 frames per second. And then I don't even know why with Ultra, but I'll bring it to you. The Ultra, or the 3060, came in at 32.81 frames per second, an 11.61% improvement over the 2060's 29.21 frames per second. At this pace, we're playing on the console, and it's still chugging. So anyway, now here is where it gets a little exciting and a big change of pace. At 1080p, still on Metro, but now with RTX, we can see at medium, we came in at 77.66 frames per second on the RTX 3060, while on the 2060, we came in at 69.51 frames per second, an 11.08% improvement in favor of the 3060. On high, we came in at 70.04 frames per second versus the 2060's 63.08 frames per second. Still all playable, but right now the 3060 has a 10.46% lead in high. Now jumping over to ultra, where things start to hurt. The 3060 comes in at 59.22 frames per second, 7.72% above the 2060's 54.82 frames per second. It's still playable, but you're gonna see a few little blip, blip, blip. You don't want that in an FPS especially. So jumping over to 1440p or 2K, we can see the 3060 came in at 57.79 frames per second. Again, this is RTX wise, 14.45% over the 2060's 50 frames per second. We're chugging along here. Coming in on high, the 3060 came in at 52.4 frames per second, 12.71% over the 2060's 46.14 frames per second. Then on ultra, 46.4 frames per second versus the 2060's 41.27 frames per second, an 11.70% improvement towards the 3060, but yeah. And then at 4K, I don't even know why I'm showing you this. I should skip it, but I won't. There was a 20.18% improvement in favor of the 3060, but the 3060 only came in at 25.31 frames per second. Now, on high, 3060 came in at 23.92 frames per second, a 21.33% improvement over the 2060's 19.31. The 2060 here has fallen asleep, and the 3060 is kind of following suit here, coming in at 22.17 frames per second over the 2060's 18.13 frames per second, a 20.05% improvement here over the 2060, but I mean, come on, really? So anyway, moving on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, an oldie but still a goodie. A lot of people still like it. At 1080p on medium, we're getting 132 frames per second, a 10.36% improvement over the 2060's 119 frames per second. On high, we can see there's a 12.24% improvement over the 2060's 115 versus the 3060's 130 frames per second. On ultra, the 3060 came in at 16.89% over the 2060's 103 frames per second. 3060 came in at 122 frames per second. At 1440p, 2K, at normal or medium, the 3060 came in at 95 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 86 frames per second. A 9.94% improvement here, which is great. On high, the 2060 came in at 80 frames per second, 12.87% lower than the 3060's 91 frames per second. On ultra, the 3060 came in at 83 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 67 frames per second. A 21.33% improvement on the 3060's favor. Now, coming in at 4K or 2160 on normal or medium, however you want to call it, the 3060 came in at 54 frames per second, 13.86% above the 2060's 47 frames per second. Now on high, the 3060 comes at 51 frames per second, while the 2060 comes in at 42 frames per second. That's a 19.35% improvement on performance in favor of the 3060. And then on ultra, the 2060 was running that way, while the 3060 was going that way. Performance is that way. Mind you, coming in at 44 frames per second on the 3060, the 2060 was at 18 frames per second, 83.87% improvement on the 3060 side. 4K, they're not 4K cards. 3060 tried, 2060 just ran away. On the RTX side, at 1080p, we can see here the 3060 came in at 109 frames per second. That's a 10.63% improvement over the 2060's 98 frames per second. On high, the 3060 came in at 90 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 70 frames per second, 25% improvement there. And then at ultra, again at 1080p, the 3060 came in at 87 frames per second, while the 2060 is starting to sweat at 66 frames per second. That's a 27.45% lead towards the 3060. At 1440, on medium, we can see 78 frames per second. That's a 29.41% improvement over the 2060's 58 frames per second. Both still very playable, even though the 2060 came in at 58. Now, on high, we can see everybody sweating. The 3060 came in at 55 frames per second, 29.17% improvement over the 2060 at 41 frames per second. At Ultra, the 2060 came in at 40 frames per second, while the 3060 came in at 53 frames per second. That's a 27.96% improvement. At the magical 4K, the 3060 came in at 43 frames per second, while the 2060 came in at 38 frames per second. That's a 12.35% gain on the 3060 side. We can see 30 frames per second on the 3060 and 25 frames per second on the 2060. 3060 did come up by 18.18%, but you know. And then on Ultra, 3060 comes in at 28 frames per second, while the 2060 comes in at 18 frames per second. That's a 43.48% improvement on the 3060 side. Now, I have to apologize to you. I wanted to bring you Watchdog Legions, but unfortunately, you would bench it one time and it would get a score, a good score. Then you would bench it again and it would never go above 60 frames per second. It could be the same set, same preset, medium, high, ultra, very high, or extreme, or you could change it. It would be higher again, then it wouldn't go above 60. And it's weird that it would not go above 60 frames per second. I'm sure there's going to be a patch for that. That happened both for the 2060 and the 3060. So it's not one versus the other. It's both on that one. So nothing new here, but on both cards, when they reach about 55 or 60 degrees, or when you set the fan curve, which I have a video up here and down there as well, showing you guys how to play with the fan curves. But when they reach that certain temperature, the fans have a 0 dB technology. They turn off, and when they reach that temperature, then they turn on. When they come back down, like when you're web browsing or using Word or something, the fans or your system should get to the temperature that the fans turn off. That is completely normal, just in case you get freaked out by that. Now, I did say I was going to be doing some productivity testing. So the program I use for editing my videos is Wondershare Filmora, Wondershare Filmora X now. I've used it forever, but it takes advantage of CUDA and streaming cores. So we can see here at this long video is about 15 minutes. We can see here that the 3060 came in at 5 minutes and 21 seconds of rendering time, while the 2060 came in at only about an 18-minute difference there, or 18-second difference there. But mind you, as the application grows and the editing grows, and as complex as your editing gets, that time is going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. Mind you, as you can see, I was rendering or exporting at 4K, so that is a ton. So the 3060 is a little bit better than the 2060 at productivity. Again, not tons, but it adds up and it will save you time. So a lot of that performance, both in benchmarks and in real world gameplay, is going to be due to the memory. Again, the 2060 had only 6 gigs of RAM, while the 3060 has 12 gigs, double the RAM. You can see here on the screen, the 2060 comes in at 1365 megahertz on the GPU clock, with the memory at 1750 and a boost clock of 1755. Now the 3060 comes in at 1320, a little bit slower, but then the memory is at 1875 megahertz and the boost is 1882 megahertz. The fill rate is also higher on the 3060 over the 2060, and with that, of course, the bandwidth. So again, to see the performance of the gaming, mind you, I went over Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Call of Duty Warzone, Grand Theft Auto 5, Fortnite, and Red Dead Redemption with some gameplay, and you can check it out on that video I have linked up above or down below when everything is done. So right now, I usually go into pricing, but right now with the pandemic, with the miners, with the scalpers, with everything, the price is obscene for everything. The 3090 comes in MSRP at $390. The black edition comes in at $320. Now this one, they've already stopped selling it EVGA wise. It was about $320 or $280. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. But no matter what, you're not going, well, chances are you're not going to find them at, MSRP. And mind you, not only those three, but then silicon shortage, and then everybody's hit by it. So I can't go into pricing. So we've gone over unboxing the card, installing the card, benchmarking the card, gaming with the card, even setting the fan and the sound levels of the card. With all that being said, I'm actually incredibly impressed with the card, especially over the 2060. As we saw, I kind of stopped speaking about it midway through it because it's on the screen. I don't want to read everything you guys can read, but the temperature on the 2060 always came in hotter, if not always, a lot of the times. Definitely cooler on the 3060, and in everything it outperformed it. The whole story about that arrow was when I first tested, I tested Ultra and Extreme, or Ultra or Extreme. Now, on the 2060, I tested Ultra. On the 3060, I tested Extreme. So every time I came up with the results, it was always, hey, everything's good for the 3060 until we hit Ultra. Then it's, the 2060 beats it. So 3 times, on top of the 3 times, I had to run all of the benchmarks. That's why I'm so late, on top of the fact that I received the cards. The other reviewers received the cards about a week or 2 before launch. I received it a day or 2 before launch, and I didn't get production drivers until launch date. By that point, I had 2 days of benchmarking, and on pre-release drivers, I'm like, you know what, scrap it. Let's start all over again with the release drivers. That way, I'm going to get the performance you're going to see. The pre-performance driver or pre-release drivers actually performed lower than the release drivers. And there was a few other things that didn't work. The pre-release drivers, the screen would flicker every so often. The release drivers never had that issue. But anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. If there's something I've missed aside from pricing, which I know I can't do, I can't do right now because everything's ridiculous. But let me know down in the comments below what I'm missing, what you guys liked, what you guys hated, not only about the cards, but about my presentation. I keep trying to get better, bigger and better for you guys. So let me know. Again, as always, please do click like and subscribe. It helps me out so much to bring you bigger and better. And if you like this review, you feel like it helped you, and you want to throw me a buck or two, go ahead, buy me a cup of coffee. Again, that'll help me out tons. All right, my friends, Iggy with ThisBytesForYou, again, doing an overview and a review of the EVGA Geforce RTX 3060 XC gaming video card, or graphics card. Iggy out. See you guys.